but I'm going to record this presentation so Becky can use it in her classes. And as always, I'll post this if you want to know more. So what we're going to do now, we're going to talk about soils like we have all semester. But now I want to kind of break it down. And some of this stuff is a little bit of review. Some of it's going to be new, and it's going to foreshadow stuff that's up posted now. So soils are not soils are not soils, right? They vary spatially. They obviously vary over time, but that spatial variation is interesting, especially if you want to try to think about what could you use a soil for, use and management. The soil survey products that I'm going to talk about a little bit today, that's what they were designed for. Over the last century, we've been systematically mapping soils across the country to help guide their use and management. What is something useful for or not useful for? How do we appropriately manage this? A lot of this comes out of our basic need to understand about crop production and places where crops could be produced. And a lot of this came out of the Dust Bowl and how the Dust Bowl led to this realization that we couldn't just let soils blow away because of our bad management practices. So we've been systematically measuring, mapping, quantifying soils across the landscape. And now the product of that is web-based resources for you to check out. You can look at any place in the country and go understand the soil properties, depth, chemical characteristics, mineralogy, all these different things. And ultimately, that's what I want you to be open to, right? Now, I'm not expecting you to become some high-end practitioner of using these things, but I want you to appreciate variation, and that if you want to know more, you can find that information very easily through Soil Web and Web Soil Survey and available resources. So a huge idea that I want to stress is that when we start talking about soils and we think about soils and how they vary, it's pretty easy. You can split things up into the surface and the subsurface, right? And if we remember back to some point earlier in the semester, we talked about the idea of E and I alluviation, right? The upper zone of the soil is the zone where things weather and things are leached, and the subsoil is where things accumulate, right? That's where the products of weathering end up, and that manifests itself in clay minerals and texture and all these types of things. So surface soils are considered epipedons, and subsoils are subsoils. And those are really important areas in the soil that help guide taxonomy and classification. Okay? So I've kind of drilled this idea into your head all semester, right? This soil forming model that this guy pretty much stole from this guy, right? This comes from Dokuchev and the Russians in 1870. They were thinking about why soils varied across the landscape, and they studied it intensively, and Dokuchev came up with this basic functional model that was translated from Russian into English and brought to the West by different people at different times. The guy on the left, Hans Jenny, was, he was a scientist from the 20s until the 1990s almost. He was alive into the late 80s, early 90s at UC Berkeley. He basically took Dokuchev's ideas, formalized them, cleaned them up, and wrote this seminal book, The Factors of Soil Formation, which is this model that we use. That completely revolutionized the way people looked at the landscape. They had something they could test. They had a hypothesis-driven tool now to test soils and understand them. Match that up with these soil survey activities, and we really started making some progress in the last century about soil properties, how they worked, why, productivity, all these really cool things. And you're a product of that today. What we've learned this semester is our collective, not collective, all of it, but we've learned a lot about what we know now about soils, right? So what I'm going to talk about now is how do we take this kind of infinite universe of variation and classify it in a meaningful way to guide that use and management, right? So in the US system, in NRCS in the West, we use soil orders as the highest level of classification, the most general, right? And right now there's 12 soil orders, and they conveniently fall into 3 orders that are kind of associated with unique parent materials, 3 orders that are associated with unique environments, 3 orders that are kind of related to age of development, either young or old, and then 3 that kind of have unique vegetation associated with them, right? These orders and this taxonomic system were really crystallized by this dude here in the trench coat with the small baseball bat sized cigar. Guy Smith helped with a bunch of other people develop this soil taxonomy that we use now, and orders are the highest level and highest in the sense of most general, or maybe that'd be the lowest, right? However you want to think of it personally. And then at the other end, we have soil series, the most distinct, the most refined mappable unit, right? Ton of resources, ton of details, lots of classification keys and stuff like that. But right now, we're going to talk only about that highest level. That's really all you need to know, is these big level ideas like, why is a grassland soil different from a tropical soil, right? And one of some of the things you could know to help know those are different. So, as I said, all the orders in our system, there's 12, and here they all are on this nice convenient poster. They're talking about adding a 13th order, like a disturbed human altered soil. It's really going to mess up their poster, right? Right now, 12 works really well, but when they go to 13, that's a prime number, it's odd, like it's really not going to be as convenient for their marketing strategy, but that's okay. So, you're going to go, I posted in the module 4 content folder, I've got a short video for each one of these, 8, 7 to 10 minutes, that gives you the high level stuff, shows you a map of where you find them in the world, where you find them in the US, and some of my interpretation of some of that stuff. So hopefully you find that interesting. Each one of these has a pretty specific set of criteria that puts it in that category, right? But with any classification scheme, it's human. There's always gray area. There's lots of details. But as I said, we're staying up high, all 12. When I post these slides, you can go to these links to give you some more background information about the NRCS system, which is the one that we have. And there's a variety of other ones in the world, but also the Food and Ag FAO has a classification system that is pretty dominant across large portions of the world that don't have their own specific one, right? So you can check those out. So once again, just a reformulation of it. These soils are a function of these 5 factors: climate, organisms, parent material, relief or topography, and how long, time, right? If we had a time machine, we could prove and understand all these very intimately. We don't. So we've used this model to try to make sense of how the soils look the way they look at the time that you're looking at them. What factors led to their current form or morphology, okay? I said it's really convenient that of these 12, 3 fall into each of these 4 classifications. What I'm going to formalize is, for this last set of notes, I want you to take and characterize one soil from each of these categories, right? When you write up a little short notes about it, you don't have to do all 12, but it'd be nice if you chose one of andesol, histosol, or vertisol, right? Andesols, you'll learn, are soils that have volcanic parent material, and they have very unique features driven by that. Histosols are soils that form in wetlands and peats. They're organic rich, like the Sac Delta. Vertisols are the shrinking and swelling soils that we have in our ricelands and other places, and so on. Okay, so good stuff. Here's just a nice table for you to check about on your own to give you the really high level why, right? If soils have permafrost within 2 meters of the surface, it's a gelisol. That's a frozen soil. If it doesn't have that, it's not a gelisol. And then you work through this kind of very basic taxonomic key to let you go, oh, okay, if it's not frozen, what if it has high organic matter content? If it doesn't have that, does it have a spodictic horizon? Does it have this, that, or the other thing, right? That's how all taxonomies work. Why do you call this oak different from that one? Well, we identify features, and we use that as a way to put this oak in that category and this oak in another. And we do the same thing with soils. Okay, we could think about soils. It's kind of convenient to think about soils kind of in a time continuum kind of sense, from soils that are forming right now that are young through soils that are very old and very weathered. Age as a function of weathering and transformation of the parent materials into other things. So you can think of it as young soils as like Baby Yoda, right? Or Groku, I think is what the official name is, that the Baby Yoda and Mandalorian and all that kind of stuff, up through old Yoda, right? So you've got entosols, which are very young soils that have very little cell development, and then you can work your way across to oxasols, which are very old, the oldest, most weathered soils on the planet. They're found in tropical systems, right? It's an interesting way to do it. You can also think of this is a nice example of a student submission to an assignment that I used to do in this class, and I haven't lately because I'm always mixing things up. But here's someone they took the Star Wars planets, thought about what that planet was like, and then associated the soil order with the planet where they think it would find it on in the stars universe, which is super cool, right? I want you to appreciate that soils are different to everyone. I can teach you a nomenclature. I can teach you the conventional way of viewing it, and that's great. But sometimes how you associate information is as valid or more valid than the structure that I would teach you, right? So I bring this up because this Soils and You assignment that you have open is kind of in that vein. Whatever you think about that's interesting about soils, you can find that and work that up, right? It doesn't have to be, well, he said farming, so I'm going to talk about farming, that kind of thing. There's lots of ways to remember and to associate. In this case, let's talk about the planet of Naboo. She said, hey, that remembers mollisols, and you'll learn that mollisols are grassland soils, and here's this nice grassland on this planet, right? These are the same as you find here, as you find here, as you find on this poster. It was just her perception of how that worked, okay? As always, I want you to be creative. I want you to think about it in a way that works for you. Okay, so really quickly, I just want to pivot to these amazing resources that are available to you. Soil Web, right? Soil Web is an online hosting of the soil survey products, and it's always evolving. So the gent that started this, Dylan Bodette, I was in grad school with him at Davis. He now works for NRCS, and he's just a prolific developer of new and amazing ways to think about soil information and how to host it. He built all this stuff for fun because he could, right? And now it's this amazing tool that you can have an app on your phone and you can look at soils as you travel, or you can look at soils on the internet and understand and engage in some of these resources. I'm just going to jump out of here really quick, and I'm going to go to here. So this was the link that I had on there, and I'm going to go to this one. So I just want to give you a quick overview of these if you ever want to use them. So Soil Web is all the soil survey products hosted on the web. You can see the same information in Google Earth. If you use Google Earth, you can download a very simple extension and see all the same lines and see a lot of the same content in Google Earth or in the web-based browser. I'm going to go to the web-based browser right now. Here we are. Here's the university farm, right? That's where I last was. Once you see the university farm on an aerial map, it's hard to not see it. It's different than stuff around it because of the pastures and because of the annual cropping. Everything else around here, for the most part, is perennial crops and tree crops. So this is literally the digital hosting of the mapping products that were developed across the last century. Butte County was mapped in the late 90s and into early 2000s. So I started in the early 90s, and they posted the new survey in early 2000s. And any map that you go look at, you can understand what soils you might expect to find there. There's a whole bunch of great information about depth, chemical composition, taxonomy, classification, land use, all these different resources that are available to you. And in my upper division courses, we work with this more because this is a tool that's free that you can use to help guide you if you're a PCA, if you're trying to buy land, if you're trying to find a place to hunt. You can use this as a really cool resource to understand the soils at your family's cabin, at your own house, all that kind of stuff. Super valuable. There's some other things here too. The other one I want to point out that's really neat and growing quickly is a generalization of soil properties at a little bit broader scale. So here we're looking at a map of the US, and you can go into this properties tab and you can look at general soil properties as a function of depth. So here you can start to think about the larger scale patterns of soils across the landscape. Why is it red over here in the East Coast? Well, red is strongly acidic or acidic soils. Well, everything from this middle part of the country to the right, to the east, is warm and humid. It rains every month and it's warmer. So there's lots of weathering, and weathering leads to lower pH soils. Contrast that with the arid west, where you have all these blue colors, and you can see that blue colors mean slightly alkaline or alkaline pHs, because west of the Rockies, we have a seasonal structural drought every year. We have 6, 7, 8 months where it doesn't rain, and that leads to arid conditions, negative water balance, things that promote soils not being leached and not being weathered, and lowering of pH. Now, you go to the coast of California and in the Sierra Nevada and the coast of the coastal areas of the West Coast, you see a very similar pattern, because much more rainfall, much more intense weathering, and soils with lower pHs. You could do this exercise for any of these properties that are available. These are all built off of observed and quantified information, samples, field observations, data generated through the laboratory, and most of these, the laboratory data set for soils in the U.S. is around 50,000 samples that have been analyzed through the lab in Lincoln, Nebraska. So this is real information, and it allows you to start understanding, once again, things aren't the same everywhere. There's variation across the landscape. So you can do that for chemical properties. You can do that for physical properties, like let's look at sand. So you can see where percentages of sand are across the country. Low sand is these dark colors, and high sand is yellow. What's this big blob right in the middle of the country? That's the sand hills of Nebraska, which is a remnant of the last glaciation. As giant continental glaciers covered all of Canada and in the upper parts of the U.S., lower 48, there was a lot of material generated by those giant continental glaciers. And this Sand Hills region was where a giant river of glacial outwash led to sand being deposited in that region. So a whole region in Nebraska that is sandy. And that shows up in this data. Same with down here in Florida, right? Lots of sandy soils in Florida, and it shows up here as surface sands. Now you can also go to depth, and you can see how things vary with depth, okay? I just bring this to your attention because it's really cool and interesting, and you can look at it and start to associate your knowledge of the landscape with soil properties at the broader scale. We talked about it at the smaller scale with the soil mapping, right? And the broader scale with the soil properties. Just have that in the back of your head. If you ever need to do a project that has soils involved with it, this is here for you. There's a ton of resources that are available that are useful for you moving forward. Any questions or comments or observations to this point? All right, so moving on. So now a really cool aspect of these soil surveys and thinking about landscapes, right? I really wanted to end, there's the minutia of this soil has these properties, but then there's the more important thing, which is along with that broader properties map that I showed you, is how do soils vary across a landscape, and how can you start to think about where soils are and aren't and why, right? Well, there's a lot of, effort that's gone into this mapping, and there's been a lot of effort in trying to translate this information to consumers, to you, a farmer, to a PCA or some other person that's trying to use this stuff and understand these types of relationships. So one way to do that is the use of block diagrams, right? So block diagrams are these really convenient way to look at a landscape and to be able to associate geographic features or topographic features and other information, geology and other stuff, to tell stories about where soils are on the landscape and why, okay? Right here, I'm showing you, this is a map of Butte County right here, And the red outline up on the top of the figure is the northern part of Butte County. Here's Chico for reference, and the Sacramento River to the west, and the eastern part of the county heading up into the southern Cascade, Butte Meadows, and in some of these areas that were burned recently in the Dixie Fire. This other block, this other red, is a slice that basically goes across Lake Oroville. And these are two very contrasting parts of Butte County. The northern block shows the areas influenced that are part of the southern Cascade, or the southern end of the Cascade mountain range, and are dominated by these Tuscan lahars and mudflows we've talked about a little bit throughout the semester. And this southern Butte County represents the areas that are the northern Sierra Nevada. So right about Butte College is where this Cascade Mountains start or end, and south of there is where the northern Sierra Nevada start or end, whichever way you want to look at it. And the landforms and the landscapes and the soils that form on those Cascade materials and those Sierra Nevada materials are actually quite different, which you would expect, right? One of the soil forming factors is parent material. And the Cascade parent material and the Sierra Nevada parent material are very different, right? In the types of minerals and the particle size, how they were laid down, how weatherable or not weatherable they are, and how quick those things happen, right? So this is a great way for you to start thinking about landscapes, why soils look the way they look, and start to build that mental model of soils across the landscape as a meaningful thing for you to understand. It also ties into these videos that I posted and that I'll be showing, having you check out the next couple weeks. So just in Butte County alone, we have 7 or 8 soil orders just from the Sac River to the top of the hill to the east, about 25 miles. It's really interesting because the precipitation gradient from the Sac River, which is about 22 inches annual precipitation, to the highest reaches of the upper part of Big Chico Creek or Butte Creek, talking about 80 plus inches of precip. So across 30 air miles, you have a 55, 60 inch difference in rainfall. High rain to the east in the mountains and lower rain down in the center of the valley. If you extended that transect over to the west side of the valley, Platina, Pascanta, Elk Creek, Stony Gorge, all that kind of stuff, you're in the teens over there. You're at 15, 17 inches of rain. Considerable difference in precipitation from 18 to 80. And that represents changes in soil, right? So through the videos, and they're laid out in order in the folder, you start with antisols out at the river and work your way up through antisols up in the mountains and cross a variety of different soils that you see on this block diagram. Each of these colors represents kind of a thematic or a generalized area. As you can see here, flood plain of the Sac River, the flood basin, which is the edge of the rice areas, the alluvial fans that we've talked about at the university farm and otherwise, fan terraces, getting up into the foothills, and then up into the nice mixed conifer forest. From soils here to soils here, considerable difference in soil properties based on the intensity of weathering. You go up to 3,500, 4,000 feet elevation in the mountains just east of here, and you're talking about 65 inches of rain and deep weathered soils because of the activity of weathering. Go down to soils down here at the river, you don't get that level of development because you don't have the weathering environment. So just a way to think about the landscape. And it really helps when you start thinking about driving from Sacramento to Tahoe or driving across the hills. And you've all seen it. You see changes in color, changes in canopy and forest type and things like that. And those are things that really are giving you some signals about variation in soil across the landscape. So really quickly, I got to make sure I give you enough time. I'm always rambling on. I want to show you a couple more block diagrams. This is from the soil survey of Lassen Park. I happened to be involved with the survey when I was a graduate student. So I worked for 3 summers digging holes in Lassen. And here we've got some really cool block diagrams that show you some areas across the park. In this case, there's 3 of them. One over here on the west side of the park, which is Manzanita Creek. One that's kind of in the central part of the park. This is the Drakesbad area. This was all burnt during the Dixie Fire, and then this eastern part of the park that has some different geomorphology and some different features. What is geomorphology, right? It's basically the study of landforms and landscapes, right? Soils and geomorphology are intimately linked. The geomorphology of a landscape regulates soil properties, right? It's one of the soil forming factors. So a little bit of geomorphic knowledge is useful. For the sake of time, I'm just going to leave that as it is because I'm going to run out of time and I want to get to one more cool thing before. You've all seen this before, right? This was the core of the soil profile drawing exercise, getting familiar with an official series description. Here we're talking about a series in Lassen Park called Scoured, and its name is meaningful. The soils that formed in these environments were the residue of an area that had been once scoured by glaciers and scrubbed off of the landscape, and other materials were deposited on top of these glacial landscapes, so we called that soil the scoured soil. You can see it in this block diagram here where that scoured soil would reside in areas in the park that used to be the center of a large mountain glacier that were scrubbed away as that glacier moved around and then melted, right? We could literally spend 20 to 30 minutes just talking about all the details that are on this block diagram. We're not going to do that, right? But the intent of me showing you these things is I put a link on here to a resource I just found today where you can go and look at block diagrams from all over the country. Almost every soil survey that was generated produced some of these block diagrams, and you can go start to understand landscapes through these block diagrams and enjoy some variation in people's cartography and drawing and things like that. Hopefully I'm not losing you. So the last thing I want to show you, one more cool thing. So from this Lassen Park soil survey that I was a part of, we collected all the soils that we sampled in the field and archived them, brought them back, and they're actually at an office in Chico that is useful and meaningful. And what we also did is we created, we took every profile and put them in one of these display boxes, right? Each one of these is a soil profile from Lassen Park. There was about 300 locations that we sampled in the park across 3.5 to 4 years. And even in this, you can see the amazing variation in soil properties just across a handful of boxes, right? So why am I showing you this? So I'm going to leave, this is going to be your ungraded take-home homework if you're so interested. So what did we do? We knew all these boxes existed. I put them in the boxes, so I knew they were there. And so my last graduate student, or actually my first graduate student, because my other graduate student just graduated yesterday, but my first graduate student, we ended up photo archiving all these boxes. We created a light box and we took high resolution macro photos of all these boxes, right? So people could look at them, so people could understand them. So this is Irfan Inuddin. He pulled all this off, and I'm going to show you the product. Here it is. So this link will take you to soilboxes.com. So this is a website that he created for his master's thesis that allows you to go look at all of the boxes that were collected in Lassen Park. So you can look at the soils from every place in Lassen Park that was sampled as part of the soil survey activity. You can do it through two ways. There's kind of this archaic by box number. These numbers aren't necessarily important. They're actually chronological, but you can go look at an individual box as sampled in the field. Smaller, that's not what I want, sorry. Trying to make it show up better. Each one of these has a pit photo where the hole we dug, we took a picture, the soil as sampled in the field, and you can see surface, litter. These are deposits from the cinder cone on the northeast corner of the park with underlying outwash and glacial outwash materials. You can go and see where that location is on the map. So each one of these boxes has a location on the map. We also had, we took cardinal direction photos of each location. So there's a north, an east, a south, and a west aspect shot from each location so you can see what the landscape looks like. And then there's some soil information about depths and horizons, and you can see the field note that we generated from our activities in the field. You can see the front and the back that has all the information that supports the development of the soil survey map. Okay, so you can go through here for fun on your own, and you can see all of these different soils. There's 300 of them, and you can start to appreciate the variation and diversity. You can also go into this multi-box selection, and you can look at soils as grouped by either series or other properties. So in this case, here is that scoured soil that I just showed you the official series description for. And it's going to show you every profile that was sampled that fell into or helped generate that scoured soil series, and all the pits and all the information that was available from that, right? So we're trying to get more funding to expand this. There's literally thousands of these boxes in California alone from these soil survey activities. And we're trying to get some funding to continue this project, expand on it, and make soils more available to people, make them more accessible to people and more interesting. Okay? That's all I had for that. I want to make sure I give you all a little bit of time here. I'm going to stop the video. I was recording, right? Yes. Where was it? Stop recording.